Yes, so thank you very much to Chris and Peter for inviting me to talk today. We're going to, because it's that time after lunch, we're going to have some audience participation. You're going to be part of a process that I'll tell you about. So I'm one of the deputy directors for the Administrative Data Research Centre for England, which was funded by the Economic and Social Research Council as part of an administrative data research network to promote the wider use of administrative data for research, particularly linked data. So within our group in Bloomsbury, which is part of the England group, which includes Harvey, Goldstein and Katie Harron, who's just spoken, we felt that one of the important things to do would be to start to sort of be very, to be specific about the sort of information that needs to be shared at each point of the data linkage pathway. And I think many of the talks today and over this week are about this not just being about linkage, but about a whole process. So I'm speaking on behalf of that group, and the great thing about the ADRCE is one of our partners is a data provider. It's the Office of National Statistics, so we were able to have somebody seconded, Rose Lafferty, from ONS, and so there's a bunch of co-authors who've worked on this, and we've got a paper that actually we're under revision for PLOSMED. That's where you lot come in. To help us with that revision, because one of the feelings was it was very much a sort of UK focus, and what we needed to do was to have a bit more of a perspective from international data providers, data users, on what that guidance should be. So what I've just passed round is the sort of table of guidance from that paper, and I'm going to invite you to write comments on this and give it back to me, put it over here, and make sure you've got your email on there. Or I think what Chris and Peter have done is to ask for a session on Thursday afternoon when we'll have more time to talk about this. So we really want your views on this. Okay, so this is the group. There were about 23 UK data linkage experts that were involved in developing these guidance, and somebody came up with the great acronym GILD, which is Guidance for Information about Linked Datasets. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to just cover is why is guidance needed? Well, lots of this is quite simple, and I'm aware I'm talking to an audience that spend most of their time getting into sort of quite complicated details about this, so this is kind of top-level stuff. But we've divided the data linkage pathway into data provision, when data is generated, cleaned, provided, linkage, data analysis and reporting. Now, why is guidance needed? Well, I think key reasons we've been hearing already is that these different bits of the pathway are either run by different organisations or different teams within the same organisations who often do not talk to each other or really understand each other's processes or the impact of what happens at one stage onto the other. For very good reasons, there's often separation of processes, particularly for security reasons. So more transparency and sharing of information along that pathway is clearly needed. And if we go to the end here, so what do the reporters know? These people that have to write up the studies or do the analyses, well, they clearly often lack information on the earlier stages in the processing. And because that's often done behind firewalls, they often don't know what to ask for. So there's a need for sort of empowering this lot to really know what to ask for higher up, and they're unable, because not much information is carried over, they're unable to assess the impact of those processes on the results of the analysis. So what Kate has just presented here is extremely rare to see that sort of research coming out, because methodologists like you are not having the privileged access to those earlier processes. If we think about what do the linkers need to know, they often have limited information about the sources of linkage error and who is affected, because they're not following through on the analyses to see what Katie's just shown, that these big impacts on certain ethnic groups and so on, because they're not party to that, and that's all exacerbated when you've got so they're not getting that working knowledge of seeing, oh, it's these sorts of names or these sorts of postcodes that are going wrong. When you've got hashing of identifiers, they're not even getting those insights. And then back at the front of this process, data providers often have limited awareness of the methods being used downstream and a lack of understanding, as Kate has pointed out, of the quality of linkage error on results. And I think there's these sort of uber issues going on. One what's been alluded to is that there is a disincentive built into these organisations that are providing data or linking data to kind of undermine data products, and sometimes that's obviously related to commercial interests, because you want to market this stuff, and of course to say that it's this data doesn't have errors, or we have sort of fantastic linkage quality. There's that, but there's also the potential for undermining the statistics that are output. So as part of this project that Kate has just mentioned with NHS Digital, we heard back to us when we were showing the benefits of adding a probabilistic step that might then affect results that they were routinely putting out. So change answers to parliamentary questions, change the ranking of hospitals based on quality criteria related to readmission rates. So there's real issues here. This is really challenging the day job, the main business of some of these data providers for running public services. So you're not going to get around that. They've got to still provide their kite-marked statistics. And I think for me this means that some of this work has to really be done in a sort of separate location or separate arm of these organisations, so that it doesn't undermine their main products. And I think the other thing that's been going on is that there's been a focus on privacy in response to sort of perceptions, public perceptions about privacy, threats to privacy, rather than a focus on utility. And we need to kind of go back round that circle, because the main justification to the public of using their data is that we can use it to benefit the public, improve understanding of services and so on. And if we're producing results that are biased, then we're not meeting those benefits. So I think examples of follow through of understanding data quality, linkage error on the results that we want to use to demonstrate that public benefit, it is really important, but it needs methodologists to be part of that data generation, data linkage pathway further up. So that's kind of a long-winded argument for why we need guidance. Now, there are reporting guidelines. There have been some of these already. There's been a group from Monash University in Australia that produced some back in 2011. And then more recently, there's been the record guidelines produced by a group from the Institute of Clinical Evaluative Sciences in Toronto, working with London School of Hygiene. So they talk about what you should report in studies. What Guild guidance is about what we should be reporting there, but also at all of these steps. And much of that information won't just end up in journal articles. It may be in other formats, such as websites, analysis plans, and so on, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But the record guidance is I just want to take you to another world. So not about data linkage. There's another world out there which is exemplified by the Equator Network, which is an organisation that was set up to to generate support guidance development for how you report a variety of studies in health. So it's just about health research, and it started with, many of you will not come from this background, but this is the consort guidance was about how to report randomised controlled trials. Now, if you think what you're doing with data linkage, it's really complicated stuff, and you might think that randomised controlled trials are relatively simple. Well, the consort guidance that was published in 1996, first of all, had a really close look at the details that you really need to give about how a randomised controlled trial is performed and how you need to report that in the literature. And it was supported by some evidence. Sorry, you've got something wrong. All right, I've got to change the batteries. Shall I carry on talking? It was supported by empirical evidence of bias, and has been, all of these guidelines are informed by consensus, but also by empirical evidence of the impact of methods on the results at the end of these studies, whether they're randomised controlled trials, observational studies, through to all sorts of studies. So I think that's a really key point. It's coming back to the importance of your methods and your processing on the utility of the results at the end. What's happened with consort guidance, which is about RCTs, is that there's been a number of extensions, 16 in total so far, and counting, about different types of trials. So now specific guidance about cluster randomised controlled trials and stepwise wedge design trials and so on. The observational studies one, STROBE, one of the 9 extensions for that is the RECORD initiative, which is about electronic health records. So I'm showing you this. There's now 325 guidelines, and there's also a paper on giving guidance about how to write guidance documents, so it goes on, and all of these are based on consensus meetings, so there's a lot of air tickets in here, but it has been extremely important over the years to improve reporting of these sorts of studies in journals, and indirectly has affected what funders demand in the design of studies, and has affected the design of studies themselves. So it's having an indirect effect. I'm not saying that our guild guidance can become part of this, because we're not just health, it's all sorts, but I think it's a useful model to see how guidance doesn't just need to be a bunch of people sitting around a table telling other people what to do. It can be extremely productive in terms of improving data quality. Okay, so I said we need information at each step of the pathway, and I'm going to now sort of run through some of the things that are actually in the guidance. But you can imagine that the outputs for data provision for the data providers might be things like metadata, descriptions on their websites. You might consider some of this information going into data applications, or even data sharing agreements, contracts, and so on. You know, some data is enormously expensive, and yet when you're making an agreement with data providers, that could be a stage when you were able to specify what sort of outputs you'd want at that point about data quality and about the linkage methods and so on and so forth that could be inserted. So I think thinking about guidance does create opportunities to kind of have some influence on the overall process. Thinking about what sort of information might come out at the data linkage level, then we'd be thinking about generic descriptions, for example, publishing the linkage algorithm, through to project-specific information, so publishing aggregate data such as tables of linked and characteristics of linked and unlinked individuals, or whatever the unit is, through to carrying across paradata, such as the pass, a deterministic algorithm at which the data were linked, or things like match weights and so on. And then at the data analysis stage, then you might be looking at detailed analysis plans that don't make their way into the study report but are still important, that may need to be scrutinised by data providers, and through to code and so on and so forth. And of course all of this can then feed into study reports, but when study reports are 3,000 words, then there will be a lot of important information that won't get into those. Okay, so I'm going to just sort of show you bits of the tables, and then we can have some discussion afterwards. But in terms of the guidance about data provision, I think there were sort of very basic things about being clear about who was included in the population, and about the linkability of the data set. So I've sort of mentioned here things like how identifying characteristics are collected and allocated, things like how characteristics are modified to reduce disclosure before being released. Very important to know about pseudonymization and how that was done. And then through to data linkage, I've just mentioned the metadata. So here, things like the algorithm, the paradata, record level indicators that are not disclosive but can go across for being used in analysis. Aggregate results that might be used in the linkage process, be relevant to the linkage process, so a flow diagram, and then details about the unlinked and linked. And then through to generic reports, what we'd hope that this guidance will drive is some thinking by data providers about how they could regularly use reference standard or gold standard data sets or other methods to evaluate the quality of their data sets and publish that on their websites. And then there's a need for sort of metadata that really gives provenance about the data linkage that's going on, so that you publish what studies are being done, and with links to publications and so on, so that others like us can come along and say, hey, I didn't realise they were doing that, perhaps we could do that and modify it a bit. Okay, so and then lastly, step 3 and step 4, there are issues about how analysts took into account linkage error, so looking at different approaches to take account of the uncertainty of linkage error and so on. And then what we'd see with the reporting step, so some of this has been covered in the record guidelines, but not nearly as not as in much detail as this guidance, but it kind of builds on record. So there's a lot in there, and each statement is quite deep, so I hope we can have more discussion about that. But just to say where this might be going next, so building on the equator network example that I gave you, what's happened with those guidance documents like Consort and Strobe is that there's often been the guidance, a bit like ours that we're writing at the moment, but then followed up with a very much more detailed and longer explanatory paper, often with examples. So I think we could think about doing that, and people that might want to be involved in that. There's opportunities for extensions to the guidance for specific types of linkage, or as new techniques come online. I think the great thing about this is that there's and then there's the need for updates as new methods, new options become available, as governance and so on changes. There may be new methods that need to be introduced. I think the last thing is that what's really good about the equator network and about how this process could mature is the need to not just come up with long lists of recommendations of what we thought of, but to really link that to methodology that helps us prioritize what really matters, what really, in all of these complex methods, which steps really have an impact on the results at the end, and so that we can sort of prioritize what is done and what is reported in these complex processes. Okay, that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Any help in providing these guidance? I'm sure we appreciate it.
After the first reading, I have 3 minor points which are not clear in the short descriptions. The first thing is there's only very short mentioning of pre-processing in one line, and I think that should be a little bit more detailed than that. That is point 1b3.
Okay, so can you write your comments on that and give it back to me? And anyone that makes comments, can you make it to the
I
item
already
as
have
well?
it per email. I've sent it a second ago.
You have, all right, okay. Thank you. Thank you. So did you want to elaborate on, so the pre-processing?
Yes, then the fields are clearly designed for the Philippi-Santa model, and all non-standard models, for example, everything which we discussed the last days, will hardly fit in this descriptive framework. And finally, the last point is there's no provision for clerical review. Usually, non-matched cases are being subject to clerical review, and I've seen no field for that.
No, I think that's part of wanting to know about the method, rather than, and I think examples like that could come into more detailed, a detailed explanatory document that would say exactly what you might want to look at.
Yep.
So point taken. Was there anything specific about the pre-processing you wanted to point to?
I think there's an ongoing debate if pre-processing is necessary and how to do it. And if someone thinks that pre-processing is necessary, I would really like to see the rules, and especially, usually you have some lists which you're using for that, and these lists are important, and I would like to see these lists which are being used in pre-processing. For example, for removing all kind of stop words which are in identifiers and which are sometimes being used and sometimes not being used, and this may or may not have an impact.
Okay. Anyone that's been, Harvey or Katie, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think we have discussed this, the kind of balance between being rather detailed in the sense that Raina was sort of mentioning, trying to think of everything that one might want, but the user getting lost in those details, and there is a balance, and I think we've tried to kind of make it general so that you can interpret this as including those kinds of details. For example, all the PPRL stuff could be in 1B4, but I think, I don't know whether you quite agree with me, Ruth, but this is as much a consciousness-raising exercise as a set of instructions to the community out there. It's to get people thinking about how to do it better, how to be more transparent, so that we get better results at the end of the day. We're not expecting this to catch on immediately, but we are trying to raise consciousness about these issues. And I think to do that, we don't want to get into too much detail, so that people then start quibbling about detail. Why haven't you said that? Because that's what I happen to be working on. So just leave it at enough of a level of generality to include all that, but not to sort of lose sight of what we're really aiming at.
Thank you.
Yes, Doctor?
To follow up on that question, is the long-term vision of this that it become compulsory in some way for journals or for IRBs? I mean, I'm thinking that while that might not be the goal now, I worry that it might evolve into that direction, the way the APOR guidelines on survey research have now become a basis for sanctioning people who do not follow them to every jot and tittle. And that I believe has greatly reduced innovation in the survey space to the harm of that field, and I would worry that any set of guidelines could lead in that direction.
Yeah.
I think that's right. I mean, we perhaps ought to label them advisory guidelines. These are not things that need to be laid down in a legal sense. That they're advice to the people involved about how to do it well. And you're absolutely right. I mean, it would be death to the, if it was some kind of legal framework and you didn't get published unless you adhere to it.
Yeah. So no, we don't. But it is a framework for saying what you've done and saying why you didn't do another bit. And the way the consult or strobe guidance is used is now when you submit a trial for publication in the New England Journal of Medicine, they will ask you to fill in the consult guidance checklist to say what you've done and why, how you've met these requirements, or to say why you haven't. So it is a framework for thinking. Katie, did you want to say?
Yes, I agree with what you're saying as well. And I think the reporting guidelines, all of them, have a lot of researchers kind of think, oh, another checklist that I have to adhere to. But we were kind of hoping with these recommendations, I might want to call them, that it gives researchers another lever for getting information out of the data providers. By saying, look at this, we really need to know this information, because otherwise it can be very difficult to have those conversations. So it's kind of an aid as well as a
And I think it is really important that it becomes a peg for bringing in methodological research. So that these are going to be updated, and we may find that that there's certain steps in that whole pathway that really don't matter that much in terms of effects on results. But for randomized controlled trials, one of the key things was allocation concealment. And then eventually, people work down to realise, well, so you need to say, were they randomised by centralised telephone services or in sealed, opaque, numbered envelopes? To that level of detail. That wasn't in the original guideline. The concept that allocation concealment is a real source of bias was in the original guideline based on the empirical research. Then translating it into the details of how you implement that has been worked through in updating documents. So I think that's what we need to do.
There's a question here. So I tried to do something similar just within the agency, and I started out thinking it will be guidance, and then we flipped it into a checklist. And we vetted it across a number of projects, and then tried to pilot it. And I picked 6 projects, and I only had one of them get back to me. So my question was also going to be about the way to get people to engage. But I agree that the raising the consciousness of this is terribly important. And mine was not as elegant as yours, but it petered out within probably 4 months. So I want to see work.
Yep, I know at ONS, so our collaborator at ONS did derive a template. I don't know if you've been able to use it, Shelley. Shelley Gammon's here from ONS.
It's certainly been circulated. I don't know of any occasion it's actually been used. Specifically, but there has been widespread agreement that it's a good thing.
Yeah, I think it's going to be rather so not quite like the consort and strobe checklists. I think it's going to be more useful for pulling out certain bits of information than a document where you go through and make sure you've ticked every list, because it's a much more complicated process.
And like you say, a lever for talking to people in various steps of the process and saying, it would be really good if, and by the way, lots of other people think so too.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So things like, asking for tables of characteristics of linked and unlinked individuals. The knee-jerk reaction we get when we ask for that is, oh no, you can't have the unlinked. So if you have this, you can say, well, okay, you don't have to give me the unlinked, but give us a table that shows us these characteristics of the linked and unlinked, so at least we can know how they differ by important characteristics. Wayne?
I just want to say, I think this is good, because I think the people in this room have done record linkage, so these might seem obvious. Usually, I said this many times, but in my space, people around me, there's not a lot of people who do this. There are lots of people who think this is easy and will do this without knowing all the details. And so I find something like this would help for many projects who want to do link, who are just starting out, for the graduate student that they hire that's got the data skills, and so I think this is very good for that sense. I think one thing that would be helpful, given that, because I think this is a very early field, and there is a lack of common vocabulary, so separation principle, pseudonymization, I use the word decoupling because when I started out I didn't know these words, so with this, if it came a table of words, then at least when you're looking at this, we know what these words mean. Because I was, when this comment about pre-processing, which I totally agree with, I was reading again and I said, wait, 1B3. Now, I think this is pre-processing, I'm not sure. Right, so if you, maybe something like that would help so that we're actually using the same word. Because I think even within this room, we mean same things. I don't know that we're using the same words.
Yeah, no, very good point. We put a glossary in the appendix of the paper, so please email your additions. We haven't got coupling in there. Thank you.
When will this be published? When do you expect to complete this? And
Oh, well, with your help, we might get it accepted. And then PLOS-MEG would be quite quick, so I don't know, before Christmas, I hope.
Okay, and don't forget to write your individual comments on the sheet, so which will be